Picture this: you walk into a room where everyone looks at you like you don't belong. They whisper behind your back, questioning if you're tough enough, smart enough, or experienced enough to be there. Their eyes tell a story of doubt, and their smirks suggest they're waiting for you to fail. Now imagine proving every single one of them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. What happens when a 22-year-old rookie, fresh out of the academy, faces off against 5 seasoned officers who thought she was just another pretty face-playing cop? What unfolds when raw determination meets years of underestimation? This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a woman who turned mockery into motivation and doubt into destiny. In a world where respect is earned through blood, sweat, and split-second decisions, Sarah was about to write a chapter that would be talked about for decades. This isn't just about a fight. This is about breaking barriers, shattering expectations, and proving that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one everyone underestimates. Get ready for a story that will make you question everything you think you know about strength, courage, and what it really means to fight for your place in the world. Sarah Mitchell had always been different. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Detroit, she learned early that respect wasn't given freely. You had to earn it, sometimes with your fists, always with your heart. At 5 feet 6 inches and 140 pounds, she didn't look like someone who could handle herself in a fight. That misconception had served her well throughout her life, and it was about to do so again. The morning of March 15th started like any other at the Metropolitan Police Training Academy. Sarah had graduated just 3 weeks earlier, finishing second in her class of 47 recruits. Her scores in academics were outstanding, her marksmanship was exceptional, and her physical fitness tests placed her in the top 5. But none of that mattered to the veteran officers at the 12th precinct where she'd been assigned. Captain Rodriguez had warned her during orientation that some of the older guys might give her a hard time. "It's nothing personal," he'd said, adjusting his glasses and looking uncomfortable. "They just need time to warm up to new faces, especially young women. Keep your head down, do good work, and they'll come around." Sarah had nodded politely, but inside she was already preparing for what she knew was coming. She'd been the only girl in her neighborhood who played street hockey with the boys. She'd been the only woman in her college criminal justice program to make the dean's list 3 semesters in a row. She was used to proving herself in environments where she wasn't wanted. Officer Mike Stevens was the first to test her. At 6'3" and 220 pounds of muscle, Stevens had been on the force for 15 years. His reputation for being tough on rookies was legendary, but his attitude toward female officers was particularly harsh. He believed, openly and loudly, that police work was a man's job and that women on the force put everyone at risk. "Look what they sent us," Stevens announced when Sarah walked into the locker room on her first day. A little girl playing dress-up in a uniform. The other officers in the room chuckled, some uncomfortably, others with genuine amusement. Sarah ignored the comment and focused on arranging her equipment in her assigned locker. Officer Danny Walsh, Stevens' closest friend and frequent partner, joined in. "Hope you can run fast, rookie. When things get rough out there, we don't have time to protect you and do our job." Walsh was shorter than Stevens but stockier, with arms like tree trunks and a permanent scowl that made him look perpetually angry. Sarah finished organizing her gear and turned to face them. "I appreciate your concern," she said calmly, "but I think you'll find I can take care of myself." Her voice was steady, professional, and completely unintimidated. This only seemed to irritate Stevens more. The harassment continued throughout her first week. They gave her the worst assignments, partnered her with officers who clearly didn't want to work with her, and made jokes at her expense during every roll call. But Sarah didn't complain. She showed up early, stayed late, and performed every task with precision and dedication. Her first real test came during a domestic violence call on a Friday night. Sarah was partnered with Officer Janet Reeves, one of only 3 other women on the force and someone who had managed to earn grudging respect from most of her male colleagues. The call came in around 10:30 p.m., a neighbor reporting screaming and the sound of things being thrown in apartment 4B. When they arrived at the building, they could hear the commotion 3 floors below. The man was shouting, the woman was crying, and something heavy had just hit a wall. Sarah's heart rate increased, but her training kicked in. She and Reeves climbed the stairs quickly but quietly, communicating through hand signals they'd practiced dozens of times at the academy. The apartment door was thin and cheap, offering little barrier between them and whatever was happening inside. Reeves positioned herself on one side of the door, Sarah on the other. The shouting had stopped, which somehow made the situation feel more dangerous. Reeves knocked firmly and identified herself as police. "Everything okay in there? We received a call about a disturbance." There was a long pause, then shuffling sounds. The door opened to reveal a large man in his 30s, clearly intoxicated, with scratches on his face and blood on his knuckles. Behind him, Sarah could see overturned furniture and a woman cowering in the corner with a black eye and torn clothing. "No problems here," the man slurred. "Just having a discussion with my wife. You can go now." But Sarah had already seen enough. While Reeves kept the man talking, Sarah positioned herself to have a clear view of the woman. Their eyes met, and the woman shook her head almost imperceptibly. She was terrified, and not just of her husband. She was afraid that if the police left, things would get worse. What happened next would become legend in the precinct. The man suddenly lunged at Reeves, trying to slam the door shut. But Sarah was ready. She stepped forward, caught the door with her shoulder, and created enough space for both officers to enter the apartment. The man, surprised by her quick reaction, stumbled backward. "Sir, we need you to calm down," Sarah said firmly. "We're here to help, but you need to step away from your wife and let us talk to her." Instead of complying, the man became enraged. "You little girl," he snarled, "you have no idea what you're dealing with." He swung a wild punch at Sarah's face, but she had seen it coming from the way he shifted his weight. She ducked under the punch, grabbed his extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the wall. Reeves moved quickly to handcuff the man while Sarah checked on the woman. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it had shown everyone present that Sarah Mitchell was not someone to be underestimated. Word of the incident spread quickly through the precinct. Some officers were impressed, others were skeptical. Stevens and his crew fell firmly into the skeptical camp. "Lucky move," Stevens told anyone who would listen. "That drunk was so wasted he couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. She got lucky, nothing more." But luck had nothing to do with what Sarah had done. She had trained for moments like that her entire life. Growing up with 3 older brothers who treated her like just another sibling meant she'd learned to hold her own in physical confrontations from an early age. 4 years of martial arts training in college had refined her natural instincts. And the academy had taught her how to apply those skills in law enforcement situations. The real test came 2 weeks later during hand-to-hand combat training. The department required all officers to complete monthly defensive tactics training to maintain their certification. It was usually a routine exercise, but Stevens saw it as an opportunity to put Sarah in her place. The training took place in the gymnasium at the academy, the same place where Sarah had excelled during her recruit training. Officer Martinez, a defensive tactics instructor with 20 years of experience, was running the session. The exercise was simple. Officers would be paired up for controlled sparring matches designed to practice restraint techniques and defensive maneuvers. "Mitchell," Stevens called out loudly enough for everyone to hear, "why don't you pair up with me? Let's see if that drunk was just an easy target or if you actually know what you're doing." Sarah looked at Stevens calmly. She was well aware that this wasn't about training. This was about humiliation. Stevens wanted to put her on the ground in front of the entire unit and prove that her success in the field had been a fluke. "I'd be happy to train with you, Officer Stevens," Sarah replied. Her voice was steady, but inside she was calculating. Stevens had 60 pounds on her and was known for being aggressive during training exercises. She would need to be smart, not just strong. Martinez looked uncomfortable with the pairing, but he couldn't show favoritism. "All right, you two are up first. Remember, this is controlled sparring. The goal is to practice techniques, not to hurt each other." As they took their positions on the mat, Sarah could feel every eye in the gymnasium focused on them. This wasn't just training anymore. This was a statement about whether women belonged on the force, whether size mattered more than skill, and whether respect could be earned or only inherited. Stevens came at her immediately, trying to use his size advantage to overwhelm her before she could establish any defensive position. But Sarah had fought bigger opponents before. She stepped to the side, used his momentum against him, and managed to avoid his initial rush. The crowd murmured appreciatively at her footwork. Stevens, embarrassed that he hadn't ended things immediately, became more aggressive. He swung a controlled punch toward her shoulder, but Sarah ducked under it and moved to his left side. When he tried to grab her in a bear hug, she slipped out and delivered a quick strike to his solar plexus that left him momentarily winded. The sparring match continued for several more minutes, with Stevens becoming increasingly frustrated as Sarah consistently avoided his attacks while landing precise, controlled strikes of her own. Finally, Martinez called time, and both fighters stepped back. Stevens was breathing heavily and looked angry. Sarah was barely winded and showed no signs of stress. The message was clear to everyone watching: size and aggression weren't enough to guarantee victory. But Stevens wasn't finished with Sarah Mitchell. Not by a long shot. Over the next few weeks, the harassment intensified. Stevens recruited 4 other officers who shared his views about women on the force: Walsh, Officer Tony Morrison, Officer Rick Paulson, and Officer Jake Crawford. They called themselves the Old Guard and made it their mission to prove that Sarah didn't belong. They started small. They would accidentally bump into her in the hallways. They would make crude jokes in her presence. They would question her decisions on routine calls and suggest that she was too emotional or too weak to handle real police work. Sarah documented every incident, but she didn't report it. She knew that being seen as someone who couldn't handle a little hazing would be worse than enduring it. So she gritted her teeth, did her job, and waited for the right moment to prove herself once and for all. That moment came sooner than anyone expected, and in a way that no one could have predicted. It started with a simple comment in the break room and escalated into something that would change everything. The break room at the 12th precinct was never quiet, but on this particular Tuesday afternoon, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah sat alone at a corner table, reviewing case files from her morning patrol. She had learned to eat lunch by herself after several uncomfortable encounters with Stevens and his crew, who seemed to view her presence as an invitation to share their opinions about women in law enforcement. Officer Morrison, a stocky man in his 40s with graying hair and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, was holding court at the main table. He was telling a story about a domestic violence call he'd handled the previous week, but his version was full of exaggerations and crude commentary about the female victim. "Woman was asking for it," Morrison said loudly, clearly intending for Sarah to hear. "You can always tell the ones who like the drama. They call us, waste our time, then go back to the guy anyway." Several officers at his table shifted uncomfortably, but no one challenged his statement. Sarah kept her eyes on her paperwork, but her jaw tightened. She had handled 3 domestic violence calls in the past month, and in each case, she had seen the real terror in the victim's eyes. Morrison's casual dismissal of their pain and fear made her stomach turn. Walsh, never one to miss an opportunity to escalate a situation, decided to direct his comments specifically at Sarah. "Hey, Mitchell," he called out. "You're a woman. What do you think about Morrison's theory? Think these ladies just like getting smacked around?" The break room went quiet. Every conversation stopped as officers waited to see how Sarah would respond. She could feel their eyes on her, some curious, some hostile, some uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Sarah looked up from her files and met Walsh's gaze directly. "I think," she said calmly, "that anyone who believes domestic violence victims enjoy being abused probably shouldn't be wearing a badge." The silence that followed was deafening. Walsh's face turned red, and Morrison looked like someone had just slapped him. Stevens, who had been sitting quietly until now, stood up slowly. "You got something to say about how we do police work, rookie?" Stevens asked, his voice dangerously low. "Because last I checked, you've been on the job for about 5 minutes. Maybe you should worry about learning your job before you start teaching everyone else how to do theirs." Sarah closed her case files and stood up as well. She was tired of being quiet, tired of taking their abuse, and tired of pretending their behavior was acceptable. "I'm not teaching anyone anything," she said. "I'm just pointing out that good police work requires treating victims with respect and dignity. If that's controversial, maybe we need to have a bigger conversation about what it means to serve and protect." Crawford, who had been silent until now, laughed harshly. "Listen to her," he said to the others. 3 weeks on the job and she's already an expert. Maybe we should all just turn in our badges and let the little girl show us how it's done." Paulson, the youngest of Stevens' crew at 28, but still 8 years older than Sarah, joined in. "You know what I think? I think she's all talk. Academy training and book smarts don't mean much when things get real. I bet if she ever faced a real challenge, she'd fold like a house of cards." Sarah felt something snap inside her. She had endured weeks of harassment, innuendo, and disrespect. She had bitten her tongue when they questioned her competence, ignored them when they made crude jokes, and maintained her professionalism when they tried to undermine her authority. But suggesting she would abandon her duties or fail to protect her fellow officers crossed a line she couldn't ignore. "Is that what you really think?" she asked, her voice still calm but with an edge that made several officers sit up straighter. "That I'd fold under pressure?" Stevens sensed an opportunity. He had been looking for a way to humiliate Sarah in front of the entire unit, and it seemed like she was about to hand it to him. "I think," he said slowly, "that you're all talk and no action. I think you hide behind policy manuals and political correctness because deep down you know you don't have what it takes to be a real cop." The other officers in the break room were watching like spectators at a tennis match. Some looked uncomfortable with how personal the conversation had become. Others seemed eager to see what would happen next. But none of them intervened. Sarah looked around the room, taking in the faces of her colleagues. Some were hostile, some were neutral, and a few actually looked sympathetic. But she realized that this moment would define not just how these 5 men saw her, but how the entire department viewed her. She could back down, apologize, and try to smooth things over. Or she could stand her ground and deal with whatever consequences followed. "You want to test that theory?" she asked Stevens directly. Stevens smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "What do you have in mind, rookie?" Sarah had made her decision. She was tired of being defensive, tired of proving herself in small increments, and tired of hoping that if she just did good work, the harassment would stop. It was time to settle this once and for all. "You and your friends think I don't belong here," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You think I'm weak, inexperienced, and unable to handle myself in a real confrontation. So let's find out. All 5 of you against me. No weapons, no backup, just hand to hand. If you win, I'll put in for a transfer and you'll never have to see me again." The break room erupted in shocked murmurs. Several officers tried to talk Sarah out of the challenge, recognizing how dangerous it could be. But Stevens was already nodding, his eyes bright with anticipation. "And if you win?" he asked, though his tone suggested he thought the possibility was laughable. "If I win," Sarah said, "you treat me with the same respect you'd show any other officer. No more harassment, no more questioning my competence, and no more suggestions that women don't belong on this force." Walsh looked at Stevens uncertainly. "Mike, this is crazy. She could get seriously hurt." But Morrison was already standing up, cracking his knuckles. "I'm in. This has been a long time coming." Crawford and Paulson exchanged glances, then nodded. They had all been part of the campaign to make Sarah's life difficult. Now they had a chance to end it permanently. Officer Martinez, who had been sitting quietly at another table, stood up quickly. "This is insane," he said. "Someone's going to get hurt, and when the captain finds out, we'll all be in serious trouble." Stevens waved him off. "What the captain doesn't know won't hurt him. Besides, Mitchell here is the one who issued the challenge. We're just accepting it." Sarah appreciated Martinez's concern, but she had already committed herself. "When and where?" she asked Stevens. Stevens thought for a moment. "Tonight. After shift." the old warehouse district down by the river. There's an empty building at the corner of 5th and Industrial. Nobody goes there after dark. Sarah nodded. I'll be there. As she walked out of the break room, Sarah could hear the excited conversations starting behind her. Word of the challenge would spread through the precinct like wildfire. By the end of the shift, everyone would know about it. But Sarah wasn't worried about gossip. She was already mentally preparing for what was ahead. 5 against 1 was terrible odds under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. Stevens and his crew had spent so much time underestimating her that they had no idea what they were really facing. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Sarah responded to calls, filled out reports, and performed her duties with the same professionalism she always showed. But her mind was elsewhere, running through scenarios and strategies for the evening ahead. Officer Reeves found her in the locker room after shift. Sarah, you don't have to do this. Everyone knows those guys have been giving you a hard time, but fighting them isn't going to solve anything. It's just going to get you hurt. Sarah appreciated the concern, but she had made her choice. Janet, I've been fighting bullies my whole life. The only thing they understand is strength. If I back down now, it'll never stop. They'll just keep pushing until they find a way to force me out. Reeves sighed. At least let me come as backup. 5 against 1 is suicide. Sarah shook her head. This has to be just me. Otherwise, they'll claim it wasn't fair. She finished changing into jeans and a sweatshirt. Besides, I've got advantages they don't know about. An hour later, Sarah stood outside the abandoned warehouse that Stevens had chosen for their confrontation. The building had been empty for years, its windows boarded up and its parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds. It was the perfect place for something that couldn't happen under official supervision. Stevens and his crew were already there, standing in a rough circle near the building's loading dock. They had changed out of their uniforms as well, but their body language radiated confidence and anticipation. They were looking forward to this. Wasn't sure you'd show, Stevens called out as Sarah approached. I said I would be here, Sarah replied simply. Morrison was stretching his shoulders like a boxer preparing for a fight. Last chance to change your mind, little girl. We're not going to go easy on you just because you're a woman. Sarah looked at each of them in turn. Stevens, the ringleader, was the biggest and probably the strongest. Walsh was shorter but broader, with the look of someone who had been in plenty of fights. Morrison was older but still solid, and his scarred knuckles suggested he knew how to use his fists. Crawford was the most athletic-looking, lean and quick. Paulson was the wild card, younger than the others but eager to prove himself. I wouldn't want you to, Sarah said. There were no formal rules for what was about to happen. No referee, no time limits, no safety measures. Just 6 police officers in an abandoned parking lot, about to settle their differences the old-fashioned way. Stevens cracked his neck and stepped forward. All right, rookie. Let's see what you're made of. What happened next would become the stuff of legend at the 12th precinct. But it would also reveal truths about courage, determination, and the difference between size and skill that none of them expected. Sarah Mitchell had been underestimated her entire life. She was about to show these 5 men why that had always been a mistake. The abandoned warehouse parking lot felt like an arena. Broken streetlights cast uneven shadows across the cracked asphalt, and the distant sound of traffic provided an almost rhythmic backdrop to the tension that filled the air. Sarah stood in the center of the makeshift ring, surrounded by 5 men who had spent weeks making her life miserable. The smart play would have been to back down, apologize, and try to find a way to coexist. But Sarah Mitchell had never been interested in taking the smart play. Stevens stepped forward first, confident and aggressive. At 6'3" and 220 pounds, he had dominated physical confrontations his entire adult life. His strategy was simple: use his size advantage to overwhelm Sarah before she could establish any kind of defensive position. He had seen her handle herself against the drunk husband and during training exercises, but he was convinced that it had been luck combined with opponents who weren't taking her seriously. "Ready to go home, rookie?" he asked, raising his fists. Sarah didn't answer. She had learned long ago that talking during a fight was a waste of energy better spent on observation and preparation. Instead, she studied Steven's stance, noting how he favored his right side and kept his weight forward on the balls of his feet. He was a brawler, someone who relied on power over technique. Stevens came at her like a freight train, throwing a heavy right hand toward her head. But Sarah had been expecting exactly that approach. She stepped to her left, letting his punch sail past her ear, and delivered a quick jab to his exposed ribs. Stevens grunted in surprise and pain, then spun to face her again. "Lucky shot," he muttered, but his confidence had already taken a hit. What Stevens didn't know was that Sarah had been fighting since she was 12 years old. Not playground scuffles or schoolyard arguments, but real fights against opponents who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. Her brothers had taught her that speed and technique could overcome size, and 4 years of martial arts training in college had refined those early lessons into something approaching art. Stevens charged again, this time trying to grab her in a bear hug. But Sarah ducked under his arms, swept his left leg, and watched him stumble forward. As he fought to regain his balance, she struck him twice in the kidneys with sharp, precise punches that made him cry out in genuine pain. Walsh decided it was time to even the odds. "This isn't working, Mike. Let's all take her together." The coordinated attack that followed would have overwhelmed most opponents, but Sarah had been preparing for this moment her entire life. As 5 men rushed toward her from different angles, she did something that surprised everyone present: she moved toward them instead of away. Sarah charged directly at Crawford, the most athletic of the group, catching him off guard with her aggressive approach. She struck him in the solar plexus with a devastating uppercut that lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing to the ground, gasping for air. Before the others could react, she had spun around and delivered a perfectly placed kick to Morrison's knee that buckled his leg and sent him tumbling sideways. 3 down, 3 to go, in less than 10 seconds. Paulson, the youngest of Stevens' crew, hesitated for just a moment as he watched 2 of his colleagues go down. That hesitation cost him dearly. Sarah used his uncertainty against him, feinting left and then driving her right elbow into his temple as he tried to adjust his position. Paulson dropped like a stone, unconscious before he hit the ground. Stevens and Walsh, the 2 remaining fighters, finally understood what they were dealing with. This wasn't the overwhelmed rookie they had expected to dominate. This was someone who had turned their numerical advantage into a liability by forcing them to get in each other's way. "What the hell?" Walsh gasped, staring at his 3 fallen colleagues in disbelief. Sarah wiped a small trickle of blood from her lip where Paulson had managed to graze her with a wild swing. Having second thoughts, she asked calmly. Stevens' face was red with rage and embarrassment. He had expected this to be over in minutes, with Sarah begging for mercy. Instead, he was watching his carefully planned humiliation turn into his own worst nightmare. "You got lucky," he snarled. But luck runs out. Stevens and Walsh tried to coordinate their next attack, but their anger made them sloppy. They came at Sarah from opposite sides, thinking they could trap her between them. But Sarah had fought multiple opponents before, and she knew that the key was to never let them surround you. She waited until they were both committed to their attacks, then dropped to one knee and swept Walsh's legs while simultaneously driving her fist upward into Stevens' groin. Both men went down hard, Stevens doubled over in agony and Walsh hitting the asphalt with a bone-jarring crash. The fight was effectively over, but Stevens wasn't ready to admit defeat. He struggled to his feet, his face twisted with pain and humiliation. "This isn't over," he wheezed. "Not by a long shot." But it was over, and everyone present knew it. Morrison was still clutching his damaged knee, unable to put weight on his leg. Crawford was sitting up but still struggling to breathe normally. Paulson was conscious again but clearly disoriented. Walsh was examining a nasty scrape on his elbow where he had hit the asphalt. Stevens looked around at his defeated crew, then back at Sarah, who was standing calmly in the center of the parking lot with barely a mark on her. The reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in. How? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah could have been cruel. She could have gloated or made them feel even worse about their defeat. Instead, she chose to answer his question honestly. You all made the same mistake, she said. You thought this was about size and strength. But fighting isn't about being the biggest person in the room. It's about being the smartest, the fastest, and the most prepared. She looked at each of them in turn. You spent weeks trying to intimidate me, but you never bothered to learn anything about me. You never asked about my background, my training, or my experience. You just assumed that because I'm young and female, I must be weak. Morrison struggled to stand, using the loading dock for support. What kind of training? He asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier hostility. My dad was a Marine drill instructor, Sarah explained. He believed that all his children should know how to defend themselves, regardless of gender. I started learning hand-to-hand combat when I was 10 years old. My brothers made sure I could hold my own in any fight, because they knew the world wasn't always going to be fair to me. She paused, letting that information sink in. In college, I spent 4 years studying martial arts under a master who had trained special forces soldiers. I learned how to fight multiple opponents, how to use my size as an advantage instead of a disadvantage, and how to stay calm under pressure. Walsh winced as he stood up, his elbow clearly causing him pain. Why didn't you tell us? Sarah's expression hardened slightly. Why should I have to? You never asked about my qualifications when you questioned my competence. You never wondered about my experience when you suggested I couldn't handle myself. You made assumptions based on my appearance, and you were wrong. Stevens was the last to stand, his pride clearly more wounded than his body. So what happens now? Now, Sarah said, we go back to being police officers. I've proven I can handle myself, and you've learned that underestimating people is dangerous. We can either work together as colleagues, or we can keep fighting. But, if we keep fighting, remember what just happened here. Crawford had finally caught his breath and was examining the damage to his shirt. You could have seriously hurt us, he said, though his tone was more respectful than accusatory. I could have, Sarah agreed. But I didn't. Every strike was calculated to disable, not to cause permanent damage. That's the difference between fighting and self-defense. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to prove a point. The 5 men looked at each other, then back at Sarah. The dynamic between them had changed completely in the span of 15 minutes. The rookie they had dismissed as weak and inexperienced had just demonstrated skills that most of them didn't possess. Paulson, still holding his head where Sarah's elbow had connected, asked the question they were all thinking, what else don't we know about you? Sarah almost smiled. A lot. But that's true for everyone, isn't it? We all have stories, experiences, and abilities that aren't immediately obvious. The problem comes when we assume we know everything about someone based on surface appearances. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, the atmosphere was completely different from what it had been an hour earlier. The hostility was gone, replaced by a grudging respect and, in some cases, genuine curiosity about who Sarah Mitchell really was. Stevens, who had been the ringleader of the harassment campaign, approached her as the others were getting into their cars. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. We were way out of line with how we treated you. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity. But Stevens looked genuinely remorseful, and his earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by humility. Apology accepted, she said. But actions matter more than words. If you really want to make things right, treat me like you would any other competent officer. Stevens nodded. You've got it. And, Sarah? He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. Thank you for not seriously hurting us. You could have, and we probably deserved it. As Sarah drove home that night, she reflected on what had just happened. She hadn't wanted to fight her colleagues. She had hoped that professionalism and good work would be enough to earn their respect. But, sometimes, she realized, you have to speak a language that people understand. The story of what happened in the warehouse parking lot would spread through the 12th precinct like wildfire. But, unlike the usual gossip and speculation that filled police stations, this story would be based on eyewitness accounts from 5 officers who had experienced Sarah's capabilities firsthand. Some would call it brutal. Others would say it was long overdue. But, everyone would agree on one thing: Sarah Mitchell was not someone you wanted to underestimate. What none of them realized was that this was just the beginning. The events of that night would set in motion a series of changes that would transform not just how Sarah was viewed at the 12th precinct, but how the entire department approached the integration of female officers into their ranks. The rookie had proven she belonged. Now she was about to prove she could lead. Word of the warehouse fight spread through the 12th precinct faster than a 5-alarm fire. By the time Sarah arrived for her shift the next morning, every officer in the building had heard some version of what had happened. The stories varied in detail, but the core facts remained consistent. The rookie had taken on 5 veteran officers and won decisively. The reaction was mixed. Some officers, particularly the younger ones, looked at Sarah with newfound respect and curiosity. Others seemed uncomfortable, unsure how to process what they had heard. A few veteran officers appeared skeptical, wondering if the stories had been exaggerated or if there was more to the situation than they were being told. Captain Rodriguez called Sarah into his office before roll call. He was a fair man in his 50s who had worked his way up through the ranks and prided himself on running a professional department. But he was also practical enough to know that what had happened the previous night could create serious problems if it wasn't handled correctly. "Sit down, Mitchell," he said, closing the door behind her. His expression was unreadable, and Sarah prepared herself for anything from a commendation to a suspension. "I've been hearing some interesting stories about last night," Rodriguez continued, settling behind his desk. "5 of my officers apparently got into a physical altercation with you, and, according to the version I'm hearing, they came out on the losing end." Sarah met his gaze directly. "Yes, sir. That's accurate." Rodriguez studied her face, looking for signs of smugness or regret. He found neither. Sarah looked calm, professional, and completely unrepentant about what had happened. "Want to tell me your version of events?" Sarah recounted the incident objectively, starting with the conversation in the break room and ending with the fight in the warehouse parking lot. She didn't embellish or try to make herself look better, but she also didn't apologize for defending herself or accepting Stephen's challenge. When she finished, Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Officially, I can't condone what happened," he said. "Officers settling disputes through physical confrontation is against department policy and could result in serious disciplinary action." He paused, studying her reaction. "Unofficially, I've been aware of the harassment you've been dealing with from Stevens and his crew. I was hoping it would resolve itself without my intervention, but clearly that was wishful thinking." Sarah nodded but didn't speak. She had known that formal complaints about harassment often made situations worse for the complainants, so she had chosen to handle things her own way. "Here's what's going to happen," Rodriguez continued. "No official report will be filed about last night's incident. As far as the department is concerned, it didn't happen. But I'm making it clear to everyone involved that any further harassment or unprofessional conduct will result in immediate disciplinary action, up to and including termination." He stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the parking lot where officers were arriving for their shifts. "You know, Mitchell, in 30 years on this job, I've seen a lot of rookie officers struggle with fitting in. Some try to be one of the boys, others keep their heads down and hope to avoid conflict. But I've never seen anyone handle a difficult situation quite the way you did." Sarah wasn't sure if that was a compliment or criticism, so she remained silent. Rodriguez turned back to face her. "The thing is, what you did last night is going to have consequences far beyond your relationship with Stevens and his friends. Every officer in this building is going to be watching you now, wondering what else you're capable of. Some will respect you for standing up for yourself. Others will resent you for embarrassing their colleagues. Either way, you've changed the dynamic of this entire precinct." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Rodriguez asked. Because from where I sit, you've just painted a target on your back. There are going to be officers who want to test you, to see if last night was a fluke or if you're really as capable as the stories suggest. Are you prepared for that? Sarah had already considered this possibility. I hope it doesn't come to that, sir. But, if it does, I'm ready. Rodriguez nodded slowly. I believe you are. The question is whether the rest of my department is ready for you. The changes began immediately. During roll call, Sarah noticed that officers who had previously ignored her or treated her with barely concealed contempt were now watching her with genuine interest. Stevens and his crew looked uncomfortable but no longer hostile. More importantly, they were treating her with the professional courtesy they showed other officers. Officer Martinez approached her after the briefing. Sarah, I wanted to tell you that what you did last night took guts. Standing up to those guys couldn't have been easy. Sarah appreciated the support, but she was careful not to let it go to her head. I just did what I had to do, Joe. I hope it's the end of it. Martinez glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then lowered his voice. Between you and me, Stevens and his crew had it coming. They've been treating female officers like garbage for years, and nobody ever called them on it. Maybe now they'll think twice before pulling that crap again. But not everyone shared Martinez's perspective. Officer Dennis Murphy, a 20-year veteran who had always maintained a professional relationship with Sarah, seemed troubled by what he had heard. Mitchell, can I ask you something? He said as they prepared to start their shifts. Of course. Murphy looked uncomfortable, as if he wasn't sure how to phrase his question. Last night, when you fought those 5 guys, did you have to hurt them as badly as you did? Sarah was surprised by the question. I didn't hurt them badly, Dennis. Every technique I used was designed to disable temporarily, not to cause lasting damage. They were all walking around under their own power within minutes. I know, Murphy said quickly. It's just that some of the guys are saying you could have handled it differently. Maybe talked your way out of it instead of fighting. Sarah felt a flash of irritation. They challenged me to a fight, Dennis. 5 against 1. Talking wasn't going to resolve anything. If I had backed down, they would have seen it as weakness and the harassment would have continued. Murphy nodded, but he still looked troubled. I guess I'm just old-fashioned. I don't like the idea of colleagues fighting each other, regardless of the reason. Sarah understood his perspective, but she also knew that his position came from a place of privilege. As a male officer, Murphy had never faced the kind of systematic harassment that she had endured. He had never been forced to choose between accepting disrespectful treatment and defending himself physically. I respect your opinion, she said diplomatically. But sometimes people only understand one language. Stevens and his friends spent weeks trying to drive me out of this department. Last night, I explained to them why that wasn't going to happen. The real test of how things had changed came during her first patrol after the incident. Sarah had been assigned to work with Officer Patricia Chen, one of the few female officers who had managed to earn universal respect in the department. Chen was known for her professionalism, her excellent arrest record, and her ability to de-escalate dangerous situations. As they settled into their patrol car, Chen looked at Sarah with a mixture of admiration and concern. You know you've created quite a stir, Chen said as they pulled out of the parking lot. So I've been told. Chen was quiet for a few minutes, then spoke again. I've been on this force for 8 years, Sarah. 8 years of proving myself over and over again, of being twice as good as my male colleagues just to be considered half as competent. I've dealt with harassment, discrimination, and colleagues who thought I was just playing dress-up in a uniform. Sarah listened, sensing that Chen was building up to something important. The thing is, Chen continued, I always handled it by being patient, by letting my work speak for itself, by hoping that eventually they would see me as just another cop. What you did last night was completely different. You forced the issue instead of waiting for it to resolve itself. Are you saying I was wrong? Chen shook her head. No, I'm saying I wish I had your courage. There were times when I should have stood up for myself more forcefully, but I was always afraid it would make things worse. You weren't afraid, and that's changed everything." Their radio crackled to life, dispatching them to a domestic disturbance call. As they responded, Sarah couldn't help but think about Chen's words. She hadn't been trying to change everything. She had just been trying to defend herself and earn the respect of her colleagues. The domestic call turned out to be more serious than initially reported. They arrived at a rundown apartment complex to find a woman bleeding from a head wound while her boyfriend stood over her with a broken beer bottle. The man was clearly intoxicated and extremely agitated. "Police! Drop the bottle and step away from her," Chen commanded as they entered the apartment. Instead of complying, the man lunged toward the woman with the broken bottle. Sarah reacted instinctively, tackling the man and disarming him before he could injure his girlfriend further. The takedown was clean and professional, using exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat. As they handcuffed the suspect, Chen looked at Sarah with genuine admiration. "Nice work, partner." But the incident wasn't over. As they were placing the man in their patrol car, he began struggling violently and screaming threats about what he would do to them when he got out of jail. His thrashing was so violent that it was difficult to get him secured in the vehicle. "Hold still," Sarah commanded, but the man ignored her and continued struggling. Finally, Sarah applied a pressure point technique that immediately stopped his resistance without causing injury. The man went limp, not unconscious but completely compliant. Chen stared at Sarah in amazement. "Where did you learn that?" "Advanced restraint techniques," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "Part of my martial arts training." As they drove back to the station with their prisoner secured and calm, Chen asked the question that had been on her mind all day. "Sarah, how many people know about your background? Your training, your abilities?" "Not many," Sarah admitted. "I never made a big deal about it because I wanted to be judged on my police work, not my fighting skills." Chen laughed, but not unkindly. "Honey, after last night, everyone's going to want to know about your background. You just took down 5 veteran officers and barely broke a sweat. People are going to be curious." She was right. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself fielding questions about her training, her experience, and her background from officers who had previously shown no interest in getting to know her. Some were genuine curiosity, others seemed like challenges in disguise. Officer Bradley, a muscle-bound former college football player, cornered her in the equipment room. "So, Mitchell, I hear you know some martial arts. Ever spar with anyone who actually knows what they're doing?" Sarah recognized the tone. Bradley wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was issuing a challenge, probably hoping to restore some male pride after the humiliation of Stephen's crew. "I've had plenty of good sparring partners," she replied calmly. "Why do you ask?" Bradley puffed up his chest. "Well, I wrestled in college and did some boxing. Maybe we should go a few rounds sometime, see how you do against someone with real training." Sarah looked at Bradley's bulk and immediately understood his strategy. He was bigger than Stevens, stronger than Walsh, and probably more athletic than the entire group she had faced. But he was also making the same mistake they had made, assuming that size and strength were the most important factors in a fight. "I appreciate the offer," she said diplomatically, "but I think I've done enough extracurricular fighting for a while." Bradley's expression darkened. "What's the matter? Afraid you can't handle someone who's actually in shape?" Sarah set down the equipment she had been checking and turned to face Bradley directly. "I'm not afraid of anything. But I've already proven what I needed to prove. If you want to test yourself against someone, there are plenty of gyms in town that offer sparring sessions." Bradley stepped closer, using his size to try to intimidate her. "Maybe I want to test myself against the famous Sarah Mitchell. See if the stories are true." Sarah didn't back down, but she also didn't escalate the situation. "The stories are true. But if you're smart, you'll leave it at that." What happened next would determine whether the respect she had earned from Stephen's crew would spread to the rest of the department, or whether she would spend her entire career fighting one challenge after another. Bradley reached out to grab her shoulder, perhaps intending to demonstrate his strength advantage. But Sarah was ready for him, and what happened next would become the second legendary story about the rookie who refused to be intimidated. Bradley's hand never reached Sarah's shoulder. The moment he extended his arm toward her, Sarah reacted with lightning speed and surgical precision. She caught his wrist, applied a joint lock that sent shooting pain up his arm, and twisted his body so that he was suddenly face-first against the equipment room wall with his arm pinned behind his back in a position that made any movement excruciatingly painful. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. "Let me explain something to you, Officer Bradley," Sarah said calmly, maintaining just enough pressure on his arm to keep him immobilized but not enough to cause injury. "I didn't fight Stevens and his crew because I enjoyed it. I fought them because they gave me no choice. You, on the other hand, do have a choice. You can drop this macho nonsense and treat me like a professional colleague, or you can keep pushing and find out exactly how much worse this can get for you." Bradley tried to struggle, but any movement sent waves of pain through his shoulder and elbow. "Let me go," he gasped. "Are we going to have a problem?" Sarah asked, ignoring his demand. Bradley's pride warred with his pain for several seconds. Finally, common sense won. "No," he said through gritted teeth. "No problem." Sarah released him and stepped back. Bradley turned around, rubbing his shoulder and looking at her with a mixture of shock and grudging respect. "How did you do that so fast?" he asked. "Training and experience," Sarah replied. "The same way you learned to tackle running backs and bench press 300 pounds. Different skills for different situations." Bradley straightened his uniform and tried to regain some dignity. "You could have just said you weren't interested in sparring." "I did say that. You chose not to listen." Word of the equipment room incident spread even faster than news of the warehouse fight had. Within hours, every officer in the 12th precinct knew that Sarah Mitchell had neutralized another challenge without breaking a sweat. But, this time, the reaction was different. Instead of skepticism or challenges, Sarah began to notice something she hadn't experienced since joining the force: genuine respect. Officers who had previously ignored her now nodded politely when they passed in the hallways. Some even sought her out to ask for advice on defensive tactics and restraint techniques. The transformation was most evident in Stevens and his crew. The harassment had stopped completely, replaced by professional courtesy that bordered on deference. Morrison actually approached her during lunch to apologize personally for his behavior. "I want you to know that what we did to you was wrong," he said quietly. "We let our prejudices cloud our judgment, and we treated you unfairly. You've proven that you belong here, and I respect that." Sarah appreciated the apology, but she was more interested in moving forward than rehashing the past. "Thank you for saying that, Tony. I hope we can work together as colleagues from now on." Morrison nodded. "Absolutely. And, Sarah? If you ever want to share some of those techniques you used on us, I'd be interested in learning. My takedown skills could use some work." This request surprised Sarah, but she realized it represented an opportunity. Instead of being viewed as a threat or an outsider, she could become a resource for her fellow officers. She could share her knowledge and help improve the overall capabilities of the department. "I'd be happy to help," she said. "Maybe we could organize some informal training sessions for anyone who's interested." The idea took off immediately. Within a week, Sarah was conducting voluntary defensive tactics sessions for officers who wanted to improve their hand-to-hand combat skills. The sessions were held after regular shifts in the department's small gym, and attendance grew steadily as word spread about the quality of instruction. Even Captain Rodriguez attended one of the sessions, watching from the sidelines as Sarah demonstrated proper takedown techniques and pressure point applications. Afterward, he pulled her aside. "Mitchell, I have to ask, where did you learn all this?" Sarah had been expecting this question from her commanding officer. "My father was a Marine, sir. He insisted that all his children learn to defend themselves. I continued training in college and studied under a master who had worked with military special forces units." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. Have you ever considered applying for specialized units? SWAT, tactical response, that sort of thing? The suggestion caught Sarah off guard. She had been so focused on proving herself as a patrol officer that she hadn't thought about other opportunities within the department. I hadn't really considered it, sir. I've only been on the force for 2 months. Time in service isn't everything, Rodriguez said. Skill and capability matter more. I think you might want to start thinking about your long-term career goals. That conversation planted a seed in Sarah's mind. Over the next few weeks, as she continued her patrol duties and her informal training sessions, she began to consider what she really wanted to achieve as a police officer. The answer came during a call that would test not just her fighting skills, but her judgment and leadership abilities under extreme pressure. It was a Tuesday evening when the call came in: armed robbery in progress at a convenience store in one of the city's rougher neighborhoods. Multiple suspects, at least one weapon confirmed, hostage situation developing. Sarah and her partner, Officer Chen, were among the first units to respond. As they arrived at the scene, they could see 3 armed men inside the store holding the clerk and 2 customers at gunpoint. The situation was volatile and dangerous, with the potential for multiple casualties if not handled carefully. Sergeant Williams, the on-scene commander, was setting up a perimeter and waiting for SWAT to arrive. But, as they watched, one of the robbers became increasingly agitated, waving his gun erratically and shouting at the hostages. "He's losing it," Chen observed. "If SWAT doesn't get here soon, someone's going to get hurt." Sarah studied the scene carefully. The store had 2 entrances, the main door facing the street and a rear exit that led to an alley. The robbers had positioned themselves so they could watch the front entrance, but their view of the rear was partially blocked by merchandise displays. "Sarge," Sarah said to Williams, "what if we could get someone inside through the back entrance? Create a distraction that would give the hostages a chance to get clear?" Williams looked at her skeptically. "That's what SWAT is for, Mitchell. We contain and wait for the specialists." But Sarah could see the situation deteriorating. The lead robber was becoming more unstable by the minute, and the hostages were terrified. Sometimes, she realized, you couldn't wait for the perfect solution. "With respect, sir, by the time SWAT gets here and sets up, we could have 3 dead civilians. Someone needs to act now." Williams was about to argue when the sound of gunfire erupted from inside the store. Everyone froze, fearing the worst. But, seconds later, they realized that the robber had fired into the ceiling, apparently trying to intimidate the hostages into compliance. "That's it," Sarah said. "I'm going in." "Mitchell, you will not," Williams began, but Sarah was already moving. She circled around to the rear of the building, using the cover of parked cars and dumpsters to avoid detection. The back entrance was unlocked, probably left that way by the robbers as an escape route. Sarah drew her weapon and entered the store carefully, using the merchandise displays to mask her approach. From her position near the rear of the store, she could see all 3 robbers and the hostages. The lead gunman was still agitated, pointing his weapon alternately at the clerk and the customers. The other 2 robbers were watching the front entrance nervously, clearly unprepared for a prolonged standoff. Sarah had several options. She could try to take down all 3 robbers from her concealed position, but the risk to the hostages was significant. She could attempt to create a distraction that would allow the hostages to escape, but that might provoke the robbers into violence. Or she could try a more direct approach. Making a split-second decision, Sarah stepped into view with her weapon drawn. "Police! Drop your weapons!" The robbers spun toward her voice, confused and disoriented by the unexpected threat from behind. In that moment of confusion, Sarah moved with the speed and precision that had become her trademark. She struck the nearest robber with a devastating blow to the base of his skull, dropping him instantly. Before the second robber could react, she had disarmed him with a joint lock and sent him crashing into a display of canned goods. The lead robber, the one who had been threatening the hostages, turned his gun toward Sarah. But he was too slow. Sarah tackled him before he could fire, driving him to the ground and wrestling the weapon away from him in a move that combined her martial arts training with her police academy combat instruction. The entire confrontation lasted less than 15 seconds. When backup officers stormed through the front entrance moments later, they found 3 unconscious robbers, 3 unharmed hostages, and Sarah Mitchell calmly securing the weapons while providing first aid to a hostage who had been roughed up earlier. The aftermath of the convenience store incident changed everything for Sarah. News of her single-handed takedown of 3 armed robbers spread far beyond the 12th precinct. She was interviewed by local television stations, featured in newspaper articles, and praised by city officials for her courage and quick thinking. But, more importantly, the incident established her reputation as an officer who could handle herself in any situation. The harassment that had plagued her early career became a thing of the past, replaced by genuine respect and, in many cases, admiration from her colleagues. Captain Rodriguez called her into his office the day after the incident to discuss her future with the department. "Mitchell, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding specialized units. After what happened yesterday, I think it's time to make that more than just a conversation." Sarah had been expecting this. "What did you have in mind, sir?" "SWAT team has an opening. Normally, we require at least 2 years of patrol experience before considering officers for tactical positions, but your demonstrated abilities suggest we should make an exception." "Interested?" Sarah thought about the offer carefully. SWAT work would be challenging and dangerous, but it would also allow her to use her skills to their fullest potential. More importantly, it would put her in a position to train and mentor other officers, sharing the knowledge and techniques that had served her so well. "Yes, sir. I'm very interested." 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell became the youngest officer ever admitted to the Metro Police SWAT team. She excelled in the advanced training, became the team's primary hand-to-hand combat instructor, and developed new techniques for hostage rescue and suspect apprehension. The officers who had once dismissed her as a rookie now sought her out for advice and training. Stevens, who had been the ringleader of her early tormentors, became one of her most dedicated students in the defensive tactics classes she taught. "You know," he said to her one day after a particularly challenging training session, "I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I said that night in the warehouse." Sarah looked at him curiously. "How so?" "I spent 15 years on this job thinking that being a good cop was about being tough, about intimidating people into compliance. You showed me that real strength comes from skill, preparation, and the confidence to do what's right even when it's difficult." Sarah smiled. "We all learn and grow, Mike. That's what makes us better officers." Stevens nodded. "Still, I'm glad you didn't seriously hurt us that night. We deserved worse than we got." Looking back, Sarah realized that the warehouse fight had been a turning point not just for her career, but for the entire culture of the 12th precinct. By refusing to accept harassment and proving her capabilities in the most direct way possible, she had forced her colleagues to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. The rookie they had dismissed as weak and inexperienced had become one of the most respected officers in the department. She had proven that courage wasn't about size or gender, but about the willingness to stand up for yourself and others when it mattered most. Years later, as she trained new recruits and mentored young officers facing their own challenges, Sarah would tell them the same thing her father had taught her: respect isn't given, it's earned. And, sometimes, earning it requires you to fight for it, both literally and figuratively. The story of the rookie who beat 5 officers in a single fight became legend in law enforcement circles. But, for Sarah Mitchell, it was just the beginning of a career dedicated to proving that determination, skill, and courage could overcome any obstacle.